The sound of a glass hitting the table was the only noise that broke the silence. In the dimly lit room of a smoky Harlem club, the air thick with anticipation, the tension was so heavy you could feel it in your bones. For 11 years he thought he had gotten away with it. For 11 years he thought the shadow of Bumpy Johnson had faded from his life. But tonight, the shadow was back, and it wasn't forgiving. Bumpy Johnson's gaze pierced through the haze of cigarette smoke, his eyes locking on the betrayer. The man, once a trusted ally, sat at the far corner of the room, looking every bit the man who had just realized his life was about to change. 11 years of freedom, 11 years of believing he had outsmarted the streets, and now, as the legendary figure entered the room, the betrayer's heart sank. He didn't move, couldn't move, not as Bumpy Johnson stepped forward, his long stride filled with purpose. The room held its breath. What was about to happen would echo through the streets of Harlem for years to come. "Thought you could hide, huh?" Bumpy's voice was low, measured. No anger, just cold, calculated clarity. "Thought I forgot?" The betrayer's face drained of color. It wasn't just fear that ran through his veins. It was the sinking, suffocating realization that Bumpy had never forgotten, not for a second. And now, the price would be paid. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a name in Harlem, he was the name. Born in 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina, Bumpy came from humble beginnings, but the streets of Harlem had shaped him into something far more than just a man. They had forged a king. By the time the 1930s had come to a close, Bumpy was as synonymous with Harlem as the streetlights that lined 125th Street. His power didn't come from brute force, though he was more than capable in that department. No, Bumpy's power came from the code he lived by: loyalty, respect, and retribution. The Harlem he ruled was a place of contradictions. On the outside, it was a center of black culture, a beacon of the Harlem Renaissance. But beneath the glittering lights of the Apollo Theater and the soulful beats of jazz, the streets were a battleground. The gangsters, the politicians, the police, all of them had their hands in the city's business, and all of them had one thing in common. They feared Bumpy Johnson. He commanded respect not just through his control over the streets, but through his understanding of loyalty. Betrayal was a death sentence, and that fact was universally known throughout Harlem. It wasn't just the criminals who understood that, no, even the highest-ranking officials knew better than to cross Bumpy. His empire was built on trust, and anyone who violated that trust paid the ultimate price. Bumpy had a reputation that spanned beyond just the crime world. Politicians, judges, law enforcement, they all knew that if you wanted something done in Harlem, you either worked with Bumpy or stayed out of his way. And even when he wasn't in the room, his presence loomed large. He didn't just control Harlem, he embodied it. But there was one man who thought he could get away with betraying Bumpy. And for 11 long years, that man lived in the illusion of safety, hiding behind false names, moving through the streets of New York without a care. He thought Bumpy had forgotten. He was wrong. The betrayer's name was Jerome. Once, he had been one of Bumpy's closest associates, a man who had earned his place at the table. Jerome knew the ins and outs of Harlem, had done business with Bumpy, and had seen how Bumpy ran things. But Jerome, like many before him, grew greedy. He saw an opportunity to make more money, to climb higher, and in his hunger for power, he turned on the very man who had made him. The betrayal wasn't some grand scheme, it was simple. Jerome had sold information about Bumpy's operations to a rival gang, thinking that by doing so, he would earn favor and fortune. But in the world of men like Bumpy, loyalty wasn't something to be taken lightly. You betrayed the man who had given you everything, and you sealed your fate. Bumpy had known the moment it happened. There were no secrets from him, not for long, but rather than react immediately, Bumpy let it simmer. He let the streets believe that Jerome had escaped, that he was free from the consequences of his actions. Bumpy had more patience than most, and for 11 years he let Jerome live in his self-made bubble of security. He let him think he had won. But tonight, that bubble would burst. It was the perfect setup. Jerome had been hiding in plain sight, blending into the crowd of Harlem's ever-moving hustle. He had started a new life, new name, new friends, new businesses. The years had passed, and the danger of Bumpy's wrath seemed to fade into the back of his mind. But Bumpy had been watching. Always. Now, as Bumpy walked toward table 7, Jerome knew the end had come. His heart raced, his mouth dry, the weight of his betrayal sinking in. The men at the other tables, the ones who had seen the tension between them, waited in silence. There was no more hiding, no more running. As Bumpy approached, the room seemed to shrink around Jerome. He could hear every breath, every heartbeat, like they were echoing off the walls. His eyes darted toward the other patrons of the club, but none of them moved, none of them intervened. The power dynamic was clear. Bumpy Johnson had entered the room, and the entire space shifted in his wake. Jerome's hand tightened around his drink, his knuckles white. He thought he could hear the sound of the ice clinking against the glass, but it was drowned out by the pounding of his heart. His mouth was dry, his throat tight. He tried to speak, to say something, but the words wouldn't come. For all his years of dealing, his smooth talk, the deals he'd made, there was no negotiation here, no bargaining. Bumpy didn't need to say anything. His mere presence was enough. Every man in the room knew what was about to happen. They had seen Bumpy settle scores before, and they knew there was no turning back once the razor came out. Bumpy stopped in front of the table. He didn't sit. He didn't need to. His sheer presence was enough. He stood tall, casting a long shadow over Jerome, who now looked up, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. "Thought you could run, huh?" Bumpy's voice was low, calm, but there was an authority behind it that made every word heavy with meaning. "You thought I'd forgotten?" Jerome's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His chest tightened. He had spent the last decade looking over his shoulder, but now, faced with the man he had betrayed, he knew this was the end. He had thought his life of luxury, his new identity, would shield him. But there was no escaping Bumpy Johnson. "You were family, Jerome," Bumpy continued, his eyes cold as ice. "I trusted you. And for what? A few dollars? You sold me out. And now you think you can walk away free?" Bumpy's hand moved to his jacket pocket, slow and deliberate. The men around the table watched with bated breath as Bumpy produced the razor, sleek, sharp, and unmistakable. The room held its breath as Bumpy flicked the blade open with a soft click, the sound as chilling as the silence that followed. Jerome flinched. He couldn't help it. His eyes locked onto the razor, and a wave of fear washed over him. He had heard the stories, had seen the aftermath, but now, standing in front of Bumpy, he knew the truth. This was not some idle threat. This was justice. "I gave you 11 years. Bumpy's voice was even, almost matter-of-fact. 11 years to make it right, and now you're going to pay for it." Jerome swallowed hard, his throat closing up. He had spent the last decade thinking that time would dull the edge of his betrayal, that Bumpy would eventually move on to other things. But tonight, Bumpy had made it clear that no one ever truly escapes justice. Not from him. "Bumpy, please," Jerome stammered, his voice cracking with panic. "It wasn't personal. You know that. But Bumpy cut him off, his gaze unwavering. "Personal?" Bumpy's voice dropped to a low growl. "You think this is about personal? You crossed me. You crossed Harlem. That's the problem, Jerome." The silence was deafening. The other patrons, still seated in their chairs, knew better than to make a sound. They had seen the power Bumpy wielded, seen how he could make the streets of Harlem move to his will, and they knew better than to intervene. No one spoke when Bumpy Johnson decided it was time to collect. No one moved when the razor came out. Jerome's breathing quickened, his mind racing for any way out, but there was no escape. The room felt smaller now, suffocating. He could feel Bumpy's eyes on him, could feel the weight of his presence, the knowledge that the razor would strike with brutal finality. Bumpy took a step closer, the razor gleaming in his hand. He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for forgiveness or plead for mercy. The betrayal had already been paid for, and now the debt was being settled. "I didn't want this," Bumpy said, his voice hard but almost regretful. "But you made your choice, and now it's mine." With a swift motion, Bumpy moved, his arm flashing with the razor in hand. The blade cut through the air with deadly precision, slicing a thin line across Jerome's wrist. The blood welled up quickly, staining the tablecloth a dark red. Jerome gasped, his body jerking back as the shock of the pain hit him. His hand instinctively went to his wrist, trying to staunch the bleeding, but the damage was done. He could feel the cold, steel edge of his fate. Bumpy didn't flinch, didn't even look at the wound he had caused. His eyes were locked onto Jerome's, unwavering. The room stayed still, waiting for the next move, for the next decision that would define this moment. But there was no need for more. The razor had done its work. The message had been sent. Jerome's mind swirled with panic and disbelief. He had thought he could escape. He had thought Bumpy Johnson would fade away with time, that he could outrun the consequences of his betrayal. But in that moment, as the blood dripped from his wrist, the weight of his mistake settled into him like a cold weight. There was no escaping it. Not now. Bumpy stood tall, the razor still gleaming in his hand, his expression unreadable. The room was filled with an eerie quiet. The patrons, who had once feared and admired Bumpy, now understood why the legend lived on. It wasn't just because of his power. It was because Bumpy Johnson never let a betrayal slide. He never let a man cross him and walk away. The room was still, as if time had stopped. But eventually someone moved. One of the men at the table, a member of Bumpy's inner circle, stood up and nodded in silent acknowledgement. The other men followed suit, their respect for Bumpy's decision clear in their eyes. No one needed to say anything. The debt had been paid. Bumpy turned and made his way to the exit, his footsteps firm, each one echoing like the final hammer in a trial. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Jerome had paid for his sins, and the streets of Harlem had witnessed the justice that only Bumpy Johnson could deliver. As Bumpy disappeared into the shadows of the night, the men at the table returned to their drinks, their whispers now quieter than before. Harlem had seen another legend unfold, another debt settled, and the story of Jerome's betrayal would be spoken of for years to come. The streets of Harlem buzzed with whispered tales of what had happened that night at Table 7. It wasn't just the blood spilled that made it unforgettable. It was the way Bumpy Johnson had handled it. There was no grand speech, no dramatic flourish, just a quiet, controlled action. The razor had come out, and with it, a lesson had been taught. It wasn't just about the betrayal, it was about Bumpy's unshakable authority, his commitment to his code of loyalty, and the brutal certainty that came with breaking it. Word spread fast. The story of Jerome's fate became a warning to anyone who thought they could cross Bumpy Johnson. And those who had once entertained the idea of disloyalty now hesitated, their trust in the streets tested by the ruthless justice they had witnessed. For the men who walked the same paths Bumpy did, those who lived by the same unspoken rules, the message was clear. Loyalty was not negotiable. Bumpy Johnson didn't tolerate betrayal, no matter how much time had passed, no matter how much distance had been created. He would settle the score, and anyone who crossed him knew they would eventually pay. But it wasn't just the underworld that felt the impact of that night. Harlem itself had witnessed something that went beyond power. It was a reaffirmation of the unspoken order that governed its streets. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a man, he was a living symbol of justice, a figure who ensured that respect was given where it was due. His response to betrayal wasn't about punishment, it was about restoring balance. It was about making sure the community, the streets that had built him, stayed in line. By the time the sun rose the next day, the rumor mill was in full swing. Every corner of Harlem had heard about Bumpy's razor and the lesson it had imparted. And for those who lived in fear of crossing the wrong man, the message was loud and clear. Bumpy Johnson was a legend not only because of his power, but because of the unrelenting force with which he upheld his code. He didn't need to explain himself. His actions spoke louder than words ever could. For the years that followed, that moment would become part of Bumpy's legendary status. Men who had seen the streets grow dark with corruption, who had witnessed the fragile alliances that held Harlem together, knew that Bumpy was the glue that kept it intact. The respect he had earned wasn't just a product of his power, it was the result of his unyielding commitment to justice. And the razor, once a tool of practicality, had now become the symbol of his legacy. As the years passed, Bumpy's name continued to command respect. His empire, built on loyalty, grew stronger with every passing year. But it was his ability to uphold the code that defined his legend. He was feared, but more importantly, he was respected. His actions at Table 7, the cold, calculated justice delivered with the flick of a razor, became a moment in Harlem's history, remembered as both a turning point and a testament to Bumpy's unwavering leadership. Bumpy Johnson's story was one of power, loyalty, and justice. In a world where the line between right and wrong was often blurry, Bumpy was a man who defined that line. When it came to betrayal, when it came to disrespect, there was no room for negotiation. For Bumpy, justice wasn't about vengeance, it was about balance. It was about reminding the streets that there were rules, and that breaking those rules came with consequences. The story of Jerome's betrayal wasn't just a tale of one man's fall, it was a story that reminded Harlem and the world beyond it of the price of disloyalty. And in a world where men like Bumpy Johnson carved their names into history, his actions at Table 7 would echo for generations. Because in the end, this wasn't just about one man's revenge. This was about a community's respect for the man who stood as a pillar of order in a world built on chaos. And sometimes it takes a legend to remind the world that loyalty, respect, and justice are worth more than anything else. Bumpy Johnson didn't just rule Harlem, he defined it. His legacy was cemented not by the blood he shed, but by the loyalty he demanded and the respect he earned. And in a city where betrayal was a constant threat, Bumpy's razor was the reminder that justice would always come for those who crossed the line.